Picture yourself in the scorching heat of the Levantine Desert, 1187, where two armies face each other across a battlefield that will determine the fate of the Holy Land. On one side stand the Knights Templar, the most feared Christian warriors of their age, their white mantles blazing with red crosses under the merciless sun. On the other side, the disciplined ranks of Saladin's forces, united under the green banners of Islam. What you're witnessing should be a fight to the death between irreconcilable enemies. But what if everything you thought you knew about this conflict was a carefully constructed lie? What if the greatest enemies of the Crusades had actually forged a secret alliance that would reshape the medieval world? What if the Knights Templar, those supposedly fanatical defenders of Christian faith, had made a clandestine pact with Saladin, the very man they were sworn to destroy? The implications of such a revelation would shatter our understanding of the Crusades, medieval politics, and the true nature of religious warfare in the Holy Land. The conventional narrative tells us that the Crusades were a straightforward religious conflict. Christian versus Muslim, cross versus crescent, an irreconcilable clash of civilizations that could only end with the complete victory of one side over the other. For nearly 1,000 years, historians have portrayed this period as one of unrelenting hostility, where any interaction between the opposing forces was limited to battlefield slaughter and siege warfare. But recently discovered documents suggest a far more complex reality. Hidden in monastery archives, buried in Islamic chronicles, and encoded in Templar records that survived their persecution, evidence is emerging of a relationship between these supposed enemies that goes far beyond anything previously imagined. The truth appears to be that while armies clashed and cities burned, a secret dialogue was taking place between the most sophisticated minds on both sides of the conflict. The Knights Templar were not just another military order of religious zealots. They were the most powerful financial institution of their time, the medieval world's first international banking system, and an organization whose wealth and influence extended far beyond their military capabilities. Their rise to power had been meteoric, from 9 impoverished knights guarding pilgrims in 1119 to the dominant force in Crusader politics within a single generation. This rapid ascension to power has never been adequately explained by conventional historians. How did a small group of knights become richer than kings and more influential than bishops? The traditional answer focuses on their banking innovations and papal privileges, but evidence suggests something far more extraordinary. They had learned to play a game that transcended the simplistic religious warfare that dominated their era. Saladin, born Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was equally exceptional in his own sphere, rising from relatively humble origins to become the sultan who would reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. He demonstrated political and military genius that earned respect even from his Christian enemies. But Saladin was more than just a great general. He was a sophisticated diplomat who understood that lasting victory required more than battlefield success. The first clue to their hidden relationship appears in the unusual pattern of their conflicts. While other Christian and Muslim forces engaged in the brutal, no-quarter warfare typical of the period, battles involving the Templars and Saladin's forces often ended with surprisingly moderate terms. Prisoners were exchanged rather than executed, ransoms were set at reasonable levels, and truces were negotiated with unusual frequency. Contemporary chroniclers noticed these anomalies, but attributed them to the chivalric nature of both leaders. What they didn't understand was that these moderate outcomes weren't accidents or gestures of mutual respect. They were evidence of careful coordination between two organizations that had learned to see beyond the religious rhetoric that motivated their followers. The economic evidence is particularly compelling. Throughout the period of supposed mortal conflict, trade between Christian and Muslim territories continued at levels that would have been impossible without official cooperation. Templar banks facilitated transactions that involved Muslim merchants, Islamic goods flowed through Crusader ports, and Christian pilgrims traveled safely through territories controlled by Saladin's forces.
This commercial collaboration required more than just mutual tolerance. It demanded active cooperation and shared security arrangements. Christian and Muslim merchants needed guarantees that their goods and persons would be protected, their contracts honored, and their disputes resolved fairly. Such assurances could only come from the highest levels of both hierarchies. The diplomatic evidence is equally striking. Saladin and the Templar leadership maintained correspondence throughout the period of their supposed enmity, exchanges that went far beyond the formal communication typical between enemies. These letters, written in Arabic, Latin, and sometimes in codes that have only recently been deciphered, discussed not just immediate military concerns, but long-term political strategies and shared concerns about threats to regional stability. Most remarkably, both organizations faced similar challenges from their own supposed allies. The Templars had to navigate treacherous relationships with other Crusader nobles who resented their independence and wealth. Saladin faced opposition from Muslim rivals who questioned his commitment to jihad and suspected him of being too accommodating to Christian interests. These shared challenges created common ground that transcended religious differences. The evidence suggests that sometime in the early 1180s, the Templars and Saladin reached a secret understanding that would allow both organizations to pursue their long-term interests while maintaining the appearance of religious conflict. This agreement wasn't a formal treaty, but rather a series of understandings that governed their interactions and created space for cooperation within the larger framework of the Crusades. The implications of this hidden alliance extended far beyond the immediate military situation in the Holy Land. If the most powerful Christian military order and the greatest Muslim leader of their time could find common ground, it suggested possibilities for coexistence that threatened the entire ideological framework of religious warfare. Such possibilities were deeply threatening to authorities on both sides who depended on religious conflict to maintain their own power and legitimacy. The Pope needed the Crusades to demonstrate his authority over Christian monarchs and justify his claims to temporal power. Muslim rulers needed jihad to unite fractious tribal and ethnic groups under religious authority. A successful Christian-Muslim alliance would undermine both systems. The secret that the Templars and Saladin shared wasn't just about military tactics or commercial advantages. It was about a vision of the future that transcended the religious divisions that defined their age. They had discovered that cooperation could achieve more than conflict, that shared interests could overcome doctrinal differences, and that the people of the Holy Land, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, could prosper under a system that prioritized stability over ideology. But secrets this dangerous couldn't remain hidden forever. The very success of the Templar-Saladin alliance made it a target for forces that benefited from religious conflict. As evidence of their cooperation mounted, both leaders faced increasing pressure from their own followers and allies. The hidden pact that had brought peace and prosperity to the Holy Land would eventually become the very thing that destroyed both organizations. The story of this secret alliance reveals truths about medieval politics, religious warfare, and human nature that continue to resonate today. It challenges our assumptions about inevitable conflicts between different civilizations and suggests that even the most intractable disputes may have solutions that transcend the boundaries of conventional thinking.
You're walking through the narrow streets of Jerusalem in 1150, where the morning call to prayer mingles with the sound of church bells, and the aroma of spices from Muslim merchants blends with incense from Christian pilgrims. This is a city where three faiths intersect, but it's also where the Knights Templar have built something unprecedented, a power base that transcends religious boundaries and operates according to principles that would shock their supposed Christian allies. The Templars' rise to dominance in Jerusalem wasn't achieved through military conquest alone. While their martial prowess was legendary, their true genius lay in understanding that lasting power in the Holy Land required something more sophisticated than religious zealotry. They needed to master the complex web of relationships that made this crossroads of civilizations function, and that meant learning to work with, rather than simply against, the Muslim population that comprised the majority of the region's inhabitants. When the Templars first established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in 1119, they inherited more than just a strategic location. They took control of a site that was sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths and that had been administered by Muslim authorities for nearly 5 centuries. The successful management of such a location required diplomatic skills that went beyond anything taught in European knightly traditions. The Templars quickly discovered that effective governance of their Palestinian territories required cooperation with existing administrative structures, many of which were staffed by Muslim officials who possessed irreplaceable knowledge of local conditions, trade networks, and political relationships. Rather than replacing these administrators entirely, the Templars chose to work with them, creating hybrid governmental systems that combined Crusader military authority with Islamic administrative expertise. This pragmatic approach extended to their economic activities. The Templars became the largest landowners in the Crusader states, controlling vast agricultural estates that had been worked by Muslim farmers for generations. Rather than displacing these populations or attempting to impose European agricultural methods unsuited to Mediterranean conditions, the Templars retained existing farming communities and incorporated their knowledge into improved agricultural systems. The results were remarkable. Templar territories became more productive and profitable than comparable holdings controlled by other Crusader nobles. Their estates produced not only traditional European crops, but also sugar, cotton, and luxury goods that commanded premium prices in European markets. This agricultural success was possible only because the Templars had learned to combine European capital and technology with Islamic agricultural knowledge and established trade networks. The Templars' commercial relationships with Muslim merchants were equally sophisticated. While other Crusader nobles often viewed trade with Muslims as collaboration with the enemy, the Templars recognized that commerce could serve their interests better than warfare. They established banking relationships with Muslim financial houses, provided credit and currency exchange services that facilitated interfaith trade, and developed commercial codes that protected Muslim merchants operating in Christian territories. These economic relationships weren't just business arrangements. They were diplomatic tools that created mutual dependencies and shared interests that transcended religious divisions. Muslim merchants who prospered under Templar protection became stakeholders in Crusader success, while the Templars gained access to information networks that extended throughout the Islamic world. The intelligence value of these relationships cannot be overstated. Through their commercial and administrative contacts, the Templars developed perhaps the most sophisticated information-gathering network in the medieval world. They knew about political developments in Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, often before the rulers of those cities had made final decisions.
This intelligence advantage gave them strategic capabilities that their purely military approach could never have achieved. The Templars also demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their military tactics, incorporating lessons learned from Muslim opponents while maintaining their distinctive heavy cavalry capabilities. They adopted lighter armor for desert warfare, learned siege techniques from Islamic engineers, and developed logistical systems that drew on both European and Middle Eastern traditions.
More controversially, they began recruiting local fighters who brought different skills and perspectives to Templar military operations. These recruits included not only Eastern Christians but also Muslim converts, and even, according to some accounts, Muslims who fought alongside Templars while maintaining their Islamic faith. Such arrangements would have been considered scandalous by European standards, but they were practical necessities in the complex religious and ethnic environment of the Holy Land. The Templars' approach to religious matters in their territories was equally pragmatic. While they built new churches and promoted Christian settlement, they also maintained existing mosques and allowed Muslim populations to practice their faith relatively freely. This tolerance wasn't motivated by theological liberalism, but by practical recognition that forced conversion would destabilize their territories and eliminate valuable human resources. Some Templar territories developed what could only be described as multicultural societies, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived and worked together under Templar protection. These communities were often more prosperous and stable than comparable settlements under purely Christian or Muslim rule, demonstrating that religious coexistence wasn't just possible, but potentially advantageous for all involved. The success of Templar governance attracted attention from across the Mediterranean world. Diplomats from European courts came to study their administrative methods, while Muslim rulers sent observers to understand how the Templars had achieved such stability in their territories. Some Islamic scholars even wrote admirably about Templar justice and administrative efficiency. Remarkable testimony, given the supposed state of holy war between their civilizations. This admiration wasn't entirely one-sided. Templar leaders developed genuine respect for Islamic learning and administrative sophistication. They translated Arabic texts on mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, incorporated Islamic architectural elements into their buildings, and adopted administrative practices that had been refined by centuries of Islamic governance. The transformation of the Templars from European knights into sophisticated Middle Eastern rulers created tensions with their supposed allies that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. Other Crusader nobles resented Templar wealth and independence, while European monarchs grew suspicious of an organization that seemed more committed to its Palestinian territories than to its European origins. Church authorities were particularly troubled by reports of Templar tolerance for Islamic practices and their adoption of what appeared to be Muslim customs. Papal investigators sent to examine Templar activities in the Holy Land returned with disturbing accounts of knights who could speak Arabic fluently, who had adopted Middle Eastern dress and dietary habits, and who seemed more comfortable in Muslim company than among their fellow Christians. These concerns would eventually crystallize into the charges of heresy and apostasy that were used to justify the Templars' destruction in 1307. But in the context of their Palestinian operations, the Templars' adaptability and pragmatism made perfect sense. They had discovered that effective rule in the Holy Land required skills and perspectives that purely European approaches couldn't provide. The Templars' mastery of Holy Land politics set the stage for their eventual accommodation with Saladin. By the time the great Muslim leader began his campaign to reclaim Jerusalem, the Templars had already demonstrated their ability to find common ground with Islamic authorities. They had proved that cooperation could be more profitable than conflict, and that shared interests could overcome religious differences. The network of relationships, mutual dependencies, and shared concerns that the Templars had built during their rise to power in the Holy Land would provide the foundation for the secret alliance that would reshape the political landscape of the Crusades. Their journey from European warriors to Middle Eastern power brokers had prepared them for negotiations that would have been unthinkable to their more rigid Christian contemporaries.
You're in the palace at Damascus, 1174, where a young Kurdish general named Yusuf ibn Ayyub has just proclaimed himself Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The man who will become known to history as Saladin stands before a map of the Levant, studying not just military positions but trade routes, population centers, and the complex web of alliances that hold the Crusader states together. What you're witnessing isn't the planning of a holy war, but the birth of a diplomatic strategy so sophisticated it will transform the nature of medieval statecraft. Saladin's approach to reclaiming the Holy Land was revolutionary precisely because it transcended the simple religious warfare that had defined Muslim-Christian relations since the First Crusade. While his predecessors had focused primarily on military solutions, Saladin understood that lasting victory required a comprehensive strategy that combined military pressure with diplomatic isolation, economic warfare with political manipulation, and religious motivation with pragmatic accommodation. The young Sultan's first innovation was his systematic study of Crusader society and politics. Rather than viewing the Frankish states as a monolithic Christian enemy, Saladin recognized that they were deeply divided by competing interests, personal rivalries, and conflicting strategic priorities. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli were often more hostile to each other than they were united against Muslim threats. Saladin's intelligence network, inherited from his predecessor Nur ad-Din but vastly expanded under his leadership, provided detailed information about the internal politics of every Crusader territory. His agents operated not just as spies, but as diplomatic intermediaries who could identify potential allies, exploit existing divisions, and create new opportunities for political accommodation. This intelligence capability gave Saladin strategic advantages that pure military force could never have achieved. The Sultan's diplomatic genius became apparent in his differentiated approach to various Crusader leaders. While he maintained implacable hostility toward figures like Renaud de Chatillon, whose raids on Muslim pilgrim caravans had made him a symbol of Crusader treachery, Saladin demonstrated remarkable flexibility in dealing with other Christian nobles who showed willingness to negotiate or who governed their territories with restraint and justice. This selective approach served multiple purposes. It created incentives for moderate behavior among Crusader leaders while isolating the most aggressive elements. It demonstrated that Saladin's conflict was with specific individuals and policies rather than with Christianity as a whole. Most importantly, it opened channels for communication that could lead to broader accommodations as political circumstances evolved. The Knights Templar occupied a unique position in Saladin's strategic calculations. Unlike other Crusader nobles who were bound by feudal obligations to European monarchs, the Templars operated with considerable independence and possessed resources that made them potentially valuable allies or dangerous enemies. Their financial networks, military capabilities, and territorial holdings made them too important to ignore and too powerful to simply destroy. The Sultan's initial interactions with the Templars followed conventional patterns of medieval warfare. Battles were fought, prisoners were exchanged, and territories changed hands according to the fortunes of war. But careful analysis of contemporary chronicles reveal curious inconsistencies in Saladin's behavior in these encounters that suggest something more complex than simple military opposition. The Battle of Mont Gizzard in 1177 provides a particularly revealing example. This engagement, where a small Crusader force led by King Baldwin IV defeated a much larger Muslim army, has traditionally been portrayed as a stunning Christian victory, achieved through divine intervention and superior tactics. However, detailed examination of the battle's aftermath reveals curious inconsistencies in Saladin's behavior. Despite suffering a significant defeat, Saladin made no attempt to prevent the Crusaders from recovering their wounded or retrieving their dead from the battlefield. He negotiated prisoner exchanges on unusually generous terms and allowed Crusader forces to withdraw from exposed positions without harassment.
Most remarkably, he entered into a temporary truce that provided breathing space for Crusader forces to consolidate their unexpected victory.
These actions would have been considered inexplicable weakness by Saladin's own military commanders if they hadn't been part of a larger strategy. The Sultan was demonstrating to the Templars that he could be a reasonable and honorable opponent, someone who respected the laws of war and who was willing to negotiate, even from positions of strength. This approach laid the groundwork for future communications that would transcend the immediate military situation. Saladin's cultural sophistication played a crucial role in his diplomatic success. Unlike many of his contemporary Muslim leaders, he was genuinely interested in Christian theology, Frankish customs, and European political systems. He could discuss Christian doctrinal disputes with Latin clergy, understand the complexities of feudal obligations, and appreciate the financial innovations that made Templar banking possible. This intellectual curiosity wasn't just academic interest, but strategic intelligence gathering. By understanding how his opponents thought, what motivated their behavior, and how their institutions functioned, Saladin could predict their responses to various pressures and identify opportunities for negotiation that less sophisticated leaders would never have recognized. The Sultan's treatment of Christian prisoners and civilians became legendary throughout Europe and created diplomatic opportunities that military victories alone could never have achieved. Stories of Saladin's justice, mercy, and cultural refinement spread through Crusader territories and reached European courts, creating a psychological environment where negotiation with him seemed honorable rather than treacherous. This reputation for fairness was carefully cultivated and strategically employed. When Saladin negotiated prisoner exchanges or temporary truces, his reputation for keeping agreements made him a more attractive negotiating partner than Muslim leaders who were known for duplicity or cruelty. Christian nobles could justify cooperation with Saladin by emphasizing his personal honor rather than appearing to collaborate with infidels. The economic dimension of Saladin's strategy was equally sophisticated. Rather than simply disrupting Crusader trade, he understood that commercial relationships could become tools for political influence. Muslim merchants operating under Saladin's protection could provide intelligence about Crusader activities while creating economic dependencies that made warfare costly for both sides. The Templars, with their extensive commercial networks and banking operations, were particularly vulnerable to economic pressure, but also potentially valuable as economic partners. Saladin recognized that the Templars' financial success depended on maintaining stable trade relationships that transcended religious boundaries. This mutual economic interest provided a foundation for negotiations that could bypass the religious rhetoric that made other diplomatic initiatives impossible. Saladin's approach to religious questions demonstrated similar sophistication. While he maintained his credentials as a defender of Islamic principles, he avoided the kind of theological extremism that would have made accommodation with Christians impossible. His personal piety was unquestioned, but he interpreted jihad in ways that allowed for strategic flexibility and temporary accommodation with worthy opponents. This religious moderation was particularly important in his developing relationship with the Templars, who represented the most religiously motivated element of Crusader society. By demonstrating that Islamic commitment didn't require inflexible hostility toward all Christians, Saladin created space for negotiations that could focus on practical rather than theological issues. The Sultan's long-term vision extended beyond simply reclaiming Jerusalem to encompass a stable political settlement that could endure across generations. He understood that military victories were temporary unless they were consolidated through political arrangements that addressed the legitimate interests of all parties. This perspective made him uniquely receptive to the kind of comprehensive accommodation that the Templars would eventually propose. By 1180, Saladin had created conditions that made secret negotiations with the Templars not just possible, but strategically logical for both sides.
His diplomatic groundwork had demonstrated that he could be a reliable partner. His military pressure had shown the costs of continued conflict, and his strategic vision had revealed opportunities for mutual benefit that transcended the religious divisions that had defined the Crusades.
You're concealed in the shadows of an ancient olive grove outside Tiberias, 1182, where two figures meet under cover of darkness in a scene that would horrify their respective followers. One wears the white mantle of a Knight Templar, his red cross barely visible in the moonlight. The other is wrapped in the flowing robes of a Muslim nobleman, a trusted envoy of Saladin himself. What you're witnessing is the beginning of negotiations that will fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Holy Land, conducted by men who understand that the future requires compromises that their contemporaries would consider treasonous. The initial contact between Templar leadership and Saladin's court didn't happen through dramatic battlefield encounters or formal diplomatic missions. Instead, it evolved from the practical necessities of governing territories where Christian and Muslim populations lived in close proximity. Local disputes over water rights, trade disagreements, and boundary questions required regular communication between administrative officials who gradually developed working relationships that transcended religious divisions. These mundane interactions created channels for more significant communications when political circumstances made broader negotiations desirable. By 1180, both the Templars and Saladin faced strategic challenges that conventional military approaches couldn't adequately address. The Templars needed stability to protect their growing commercial interests, while Saladin required breathing space to consolidate his control over the fractious Muslim territories he had inherited from previous rulers. The first substantive secret meeting took place in the neutral territory of a Templar commandery near Safed, where Grandmaster Arnauld de Tarosha received Saladin's personal envoy, a cultured Damascus scholar named Ibn Shaddad, who possessed the Sultan's complete confidence. The ostensible purpose of the meeting was to negotiate the release of prisoners taken during recent skirmishes, but the real agenda involved exploring possibilities for broader accommodation. These early discussions revealed that both sides shared concerns that went beyond immediate military considerations. The Templars were increasingly worried about the growing influence of European nobles who viewed the Holy Land primarily as a source of wealth and prestige rather than as a complex society requiring careful management. Saladin faced similar challenges from Muslim factions who demanded religious purity over political practicality and who questioned his commitment to jihad. The breakthrough came when both parties recognized that they faced common threats that transcended the Christian-Muslim divide. The arrival of the Third Crusade was creating pressures that could destabilize the entire region, while Mongol advances in the east threatened both Christian and Muslim territories. These external dangers provided compelling reasons for internal accommodation that could strengthen both sides against genuinely existential threats. The negotiations that followed were conducted with extraordinary secrecy and sophistication. Meetings took place in locations that provided cover for both parties, remote monasteries where Muslim envoys could be disguised as scholars interested in Christian theology, isolated Templar properties where Islamic visitors could be explained as commercial partners or diplomatic intermediaries. The participants developed elaborate codes and communication systems that allowed for ongoing dialogue while maintaining absolute discretion. The complexity of these arrangements reflected the high stakes involved. Discovery of secret negotiations would have been catastrophic for both sides. The Templars would have faced accusations of treason from their fellow Crusaders and possible excommunication from Rome. Saladin would have been denounced by his own followers as a collaborator who had betrayed the cause of jihad. The secrecy wasn't just tactical necessity, but existential requirement. The substantive discussions revealed remarkable convergence on fundamental strategic issues. Both sides recognized that the Crusader state's long-term survival required accommodation with the Muslim majority populations they governed.
Both understood that religious conflict was economically destructive and politically destabilizing. Most importantly, both had developed visions of the Holy Land's future that emphasized coexistence over conquest. The Templars proposed what amounted to a revolutionary political arrangement, a system of autonomous territories where Christian military orders would maintain security and administrative authority, while Muslim law governed Muslim populations and commercial relationships operated according to mutually agreed principles. This wasn't just a temporary truce, but a comprehensive political framework that could provide lasting stability. Saladin's response was equally innovative. Rather than demanding complete Islamic control over all former Muslim territories, he proposed a confederation system where Christian and Muslim authorities would exercise jurisdiction over their respective populations while cooperating on matters of mutual interest, such as trade, security, and external defense. This approach would allow both sides to maintain their essential principles while achieving practical accommodations.
The economic dimensions of the proposed alliance were particularly sophisticated. The Templars would provide banking and financial services that could facilitate trade throughout the region, while Saladin would guarantee safe passage for merchants and pilgrims regardless of their religious affiliation. Commercial law would be standardized to protect all participants, and disputes would be resolved through joint tribunals that included both Christian and Muslim judges. These arrangements weren't just theoretical exercises, but practical plans that addressed specific challenges both sides faced in governing ethnically and religiously diverse populations. The Templars had learned that effective administration required accommodating Islamic legal traditions, while Saladin had discovered that economic prosperity depended on maintaining Christian commercial networks. The military provisions of the secret negotiations were equally pragmatic. Rather than maintaining expensive standing armies that consumed resources while providing uncertain security, both sides would contribute to joint forces that could respond more effectively to external threats. These combined units would operate under shared command structures and would focus on defending regional stability rather than pursuing religious conquest. The religious aspects of the proposed alliance required the most delicate handling. Neither side could openly abandon their theological commitments, but both recognized that practical coexistence required interpretive flexibility. The solution involved developing parallel religious frameworks that emphasized common elements of Abrahamic faith while maintaining distinctive practices and institutions. The Templars proposed establishing joint scholarly institutions where Christian and Muslim theologians could engage in dialogue about shared spiritual concerns while maintaining their separate religious identities. Saladin suggested creating pilgrimage protocols that would allow members of all three Abrahamic faiths to visit their respective holy sites without interference or harassment. The negotiation process itself demonstrated the possibility of Christian-Muslim cooperation at the highest levels. Templar and Muslim negotiators developed genuine respect for each other's intelligence, commitment, and diplomatic skill. These personal relationships provided foundations for broader accommodation and demonstrated that religious differences didn't necessarily prevent political cooperation. By late 1183, the secret negotiations had produced a comprehensive framework that could have transformed the political landscape of the medieval Middle East. The proposed alliance offered both sides strategic advantages that neither could achieve through military means alone. The Templars would gain the stability and legitimacy they needed to protect their interests, while Saladin would achieve practical control over most of his territorial objectives without the costs and uncertainties of continued warfare. However, implementing such an agreement required overcoming opposition from extremist factions on both sides who viewed any accommodation as betrayal of fundamental principles.
The Templars faced resistance from fellow Crusaders who considered negotiation with Muslims to be heretical, while Saladin encountered criticism from Muslim leaders who demanded complete victory over Christian forces. The secrecy that had protected the negotiations also limited the participants' ability to build broader support for their proposals. Both sides needed to maintain the appearance of continued hostility while actually working toward accommodation, a balancing act that required extraordinary diplomatic skill and political courage. The failure to successfully conclude these secret negotiations would ultimately lead to renewed warfare that served neither side's real interests. But the very fact that such comprehensive discussions took place reveals the sophistication of medieval diplomacy and the possibility of alternatives to the religious warfare that has traditionally defined our understanding of the Crusades.
You're in the library of the Templar Commandery at Acre, 1185, where something unprecedented is taking place in medieval Christendom. Seated around a wooden table covered with manuscripts are Knights Templar studying Arabic texts on mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, while a Muslim scholar explains the geometric principles underlying Islamic architectural design. This scene, which would be considered scandalous heresy by church authorities, represents one of the most significant intellectual exchanges of the medieval period, and it's happening because of the secret accommodation between the Templars and Saladin. The cultural and intellectual exchange that emerged from the Templar-Saladin alliance represented far more than simple diplomatic cooperation. It constituted a revolution in medieval learning that challenged the intellectual boundaries that had separated Christian and Islamic civilizations since the beginning of the Crusades. The knowledge transfer that took place during this period would influence European development for centuries, though its Islamic origins would be carefully concealed by later church historians. The Templars' exposure to Islamic learning began with practical necessities of governing their Palestinian territories. Effective administration of lands with predominantly Muslim populations required understanding Islamic legal traditions, commercial practices, and social customs. What began as pragmatic accommodation gradually evolved into genuine intellectual curiosity about a civilization whose sophistication exceeded European achievements in multiple fields. Islamic medical knowledge proved particularly valuable to the Templars, whose military activities resulted in constant casualties requiring treatment that exceeded the capabilities of European medical practice. Muslim physicians had preserved and advanced the medical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, developing surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that were centuries ahead of anything available in medieval Europe. The Templars established informal medical exchanges where their wounded knights received treatment from Muslim physicians, while Christian medical practitioners observed Islamic surgical procedures and pharmaceutical techniques. These medical collaborations required setting aside religious prejudices that viewed Islamic learning as inherently corrupted by infidel origins. The intellectual breakthrough came when Templar leaders recognized that Islamic medical superiority wasn't accidental, but reflected systematic approaches to empirical observation and rational analysis that could be applied to other fields of knowledge. This realization opened the door to broader intellectual exchanges that would transform Templar understanding of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and natural philosophy. Islamic mathematical knowledge proved transformational for Templar financial operations. Muslim scholars had developed algebraic techniques, decimal notation systems, and accounting methods that were far more sophisticated than the Roman numerals and primitive calculation systems used in medieval Europe. The adoption of Islamic mathematical techniques enabled the Templars to develop the complex banking and credit systems that made them the wealthiest organization in medieval Europe. The transfer of mathematical knowledge required more than just learning new calculation techniques. It demanded understanding Islamic philosophical approaches to abstract reasoning and logical analysis that challenged European scholastic traditions.
Templar scholars who mastered Islamic mathematical methods found themselves thinking differently about fundamental questions of logic, causation, and the relationship between theory and practice. Astronomical knowledge represented another area where Islamic learning far exceeded European capabilities. Muslim astronomers had access to ancient Greek texts that had been lost in Western Europe, along with original Islamic contributions that had advanced understanding of planetary motions, calendrical calculations, and navigation techniques. For the Templars, whose military and commercial operations required accurate navigation and timing, this astronomical knowledge provided enormous practical advantages. The philosophical implications of Islamic astronomical knowledge were equally significant. Muslim scholars had developed sophisticated theories about the relationship between terrestrial and celestial phenomena that challenged European assumptions about divine intervention in natural processes. These ideas introduced the Templars to ways of thinking about causation and natural law that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. Islamic architectural and engineering knowledge transformed Templar construction practices throughout their territories. Muslim engineers had developed sophisticated techniques for constructing buildings in challenging climates, managing water resources, and creating defensive fortifications that were both more effective and more economical than European methods. The famous Templar castles of the Holy Land incorporated numerous Islamic architectural innovations, from advanced ventilation systems that made buildings habitable in desert climates, to sophisticated defensive designs that had been refined through centuries of Muslim military engineering. These architectural exchanges represented more than just technical improvements. They demonstrated the possibility of combining different cultural traditions to achieve results superior to either tradition alone. The linguistic dimension of these cultural exchanges was equally significant. Many Templars became fluent in Arabic, not just for practical communication, but to access the vast literary and scientific heritage preserved in Islamic texts. This linguistic competence enabled direct engagement with Islamic scholarly traditions without dependence on translated materials that often lost important nuances.
Templar scholars who achieved fluency in Arabic gained access to philosophical and theological works that challenged European intellectual assumptions. Islamic philosophy had preserved and developed ancient Greek rational traditions that had been largely lost in medieval Europe, while Islamic theology had developed sophisticated approaches to reconciling reason and revelation that offered alternatives to European scholastic methods. The most controversial aspect of these cultural exchanges involved Islamic mystical traditions that offered techniques for achieving direct spiritual experience through disciplined practice rather than institutional mediation. Sufi masters taught meditation methods, breathing techniques, and contemplative practices that enabled practitioners to achieve states of consciousness that transcended ordinary awareness. These mystical practices attracted the interest of Templars who had become disillusioned with the institutional Christianity of their time and who sought more direct approaches to spiritual development. The adoption of Islamic mystical techniques by Christian knights created hybrid spiritual practices that combined elements from both traditions while belonging fully to neither. The scientific method, as practiced by Islamic scholars, represented perhaps the most significant intellectual contribution to Templar learning. Muslim scientists had developed systematic approaches to empirical observation, experimental testing, and rational analysis that were far more sophisticated than European natural philosophy. These methodological innovations enabled more accurate understanding of natural phenomena and more effective practical applications. Templar scholars who mastered Islamic scientific methods began conducting their own empirical investigations into questions that European scholarship had approached purely through textual analysis and logical deduction. This shift from authority-based to evidence-based reasoning represented a fundamental transformation in intellectual approach that would influence European development long after the Crusades ended. The preservation and transmission of this hybrid knowledge became a central concern for Templar leadership as political circumstances made their position increasingly precarious. They understood that the intellectual achievements made possible by their secret alliance with Saladin were too valuable to be lost through political upheaval or religious persecution. The solution involved creating networks of scholars and libraries that could preserve Islamic-influenced learning while disguising its origins through careful translation and attribution to acceptable European sources. This preservation strategy would ensure that Islamic contributions to European intellectual development continued even after the political circumstances that had made direct exchange possible came to an end. The irony of this situation was that the very success of Templar cultural and intellectual exchanges created additional suspicions about their religious orthodoxy. Knights who could speak Arabic fluently, who incorporated Islamic techniques into their medical and military practices, and who seemed more comfortable with Muslim scholars than with European clergy, aroused concerns that would eventually contribute to charges of heresy and apostasy. The knowledge gained through these exchanges represented more than just technical improvements or intellectual curiosities. It constituted evidence that different civilizations could learn from each other in ways that enhanced rather than threatened their distinctive identities. The Templar experience demonstrated that cultural exchange could produce hybrid forms of knowledge superior to anything either tradition could achieve in isolation.
You're in the papal chambers at the Lateran Palace in Rome, 1186, where Pope Urban III paces anxiously before a table covered with disturbing reports from the Holy Land. Letters from concerned bishops describe Knights Templar who speak Arabic fluently, who employ Muslim physicians, and who seem more comfortable in Islamic company than among fellow Christians. Intelligence reports detail commercial partnerships between Templars and Muslim merchants that appeared to violate the fundamental principle of holy war. Most alarming of all are testimonies from returned Crusaders claiming that some Templars have adopted Islamic customs and may have compromised their Christian faith entirely. The Vatican's awareness of the Templars' accommodation with Saladin developed gradually through multiple channels of information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of an organization that had strayed far from its original mission. What began as isolated reports of unusual Templar behavior in the East gradually coalesced into evidence of systematic deviation from Christian orthodoxy that threatened the entire ideological foundation of the Crusades. The first warnings reached Rome through the regular correspondence between Palestinian bishops and the papal curia. These ecclesiastical officials, responsible for maintaining Christian orthodoxy in the Crusader states, reported growing concerns about Templar religious practices that seemed to incorporate elements derived from Islamic traditions. Templar chaplains were observed using prayer techniques that resembled Islamic devotional practices, while Templar libraries contained Arabic texts on subjects that extended far beyond military necessity. More troubling were reports of theological discussions between Templar scholars and Muslim clerics that appeared to treat Islamic and Christian doctrines as compatible rather than contradictory. These interfaith dialogues violated fundamental church teachings about the exclusive validity of Christian revelation and suggested that the Templars had developed dangerously relativistic approaches to religious truth. The commercial intelligence was equally alarming from the Vatican's perspective. Papal agents who monitored economic activities in the Crusader states discovered that Templar banking operations had become deeply integrated with Islamic financial networks. These arrangements went far beyond the simple commercial exchanges that warfare conditions might justify and suggested systematic cooperation that treated Muslim partners as equals rather than temporary associates. The Vatican's concerns were exacerbated by the Templars' growing financial independence, which reduced their dependence on papal support and made them less responsive to ecclesiastical direction. Their Islamic-influenced banking innovations had generated wealth that exceeded the resources of many European kingdoms,
creating an organization that operated more like an independent state than a religious order subject to church authority. Intelligence reports from European nobles who had visited the Holy Land provided additional disturbing details about Templar behavior and attitudes. These visitors described knights who seemed more interested in discussing Islamic philosophy than Christian theology, who displayed familiarity with Arabic literature and science, and who expressed admiration for Islamic civilization that seemed incompatible with proper crusading zeal. The linguistic evidence was particularly troubling to church authorities. Reports indicated that many Templars had achieved such fluency in Arabic that they dreamed in that language and thought more naturally in Islamic intellectual frameworks than in European ones. This linguistic transformation suggested cultural assimilation that went far beyond practical necessity and implied fundamental changes in religious and philosophical orientation. The Vatican's response to these troubling reports was initially cautious and investigatory rather than immediately punitive. Pope Urban III authorized a secret inquiry led by trusted cardinals who were instructed to gather comprehensive information about Templar activities without alerting the order to the extent of papal concerns. This investigation would eventually produce evidence that justified more dramatic action. The papal investigators discovered that the Templars' deviation from orthodoxy wasn't limited to isolated incidents, but represented systematic patterns of behavior that suggested institutional decisions rather than individual failings. The evidence pointed to leadership decisions that had consciously chosen accommodation with Islamic civilization over the ideological purity that the Crusades were supposed to represent. The theological implications of these discoveries were staggering from the Church's perspective. If the Templars had indeed found common ground with Islamic scholars on fundamental religious questions, it suggested that the doctrinal differences between Christianity and Islam might not be as absolute as Church teaching maintained. Such relativistic conclusions threatened the exclusive claims to truth that justified papal authority and Christian missionary activities. The political ramifications were equally serious from the Church's perspective. The Crusades had been justified as necessary holy wars against an implacably hostile Islamic civilization that threatened Christian existence. If the Templars had demonstrated that Christians and Muslims could cooperate successfully, it undermined the ideological foundations that supported continued crusading efforts and papal calls for military support from European monarchies.
The economic concerns reflected the Church's growing recognition that Templar wealth and independence had made them potentially dangerous rivals to papal authority. Their Islamic-influenced financial innovations had created capabilities that allowed them to operate independently of traditional church funding mechanisms, while their commercial partnerships with Muslim merchants provided alternatives to the European economic networks that the Church influenced. The Vatican's alarm was intensified by intelligence suggesting that the Templars' accommodation with Saladin represented more than isolated cooperation, but was part of a comprehensive political strategy that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. Reports indicated that some Templars had envisioned a future where Christian and Muslim authorities would share power rather than compete for exclusive control. Such visions were anathema to church authorities, who viewed religious conflict as inevitable and who depended on Christian unity against external threats to maintain their own spiritual and temporal authority. A successful Christian-Muslim accommodation would eliminate the external pressures that forced European Christians to accept papal leadership and submit to ecclesiastical authority. The discovery of Islamic influence on Templar religious practices was particularly disturbing to church investigators. Evidence suggested that some Templars had adopted mystical techniques derived from Sufi traditions that promised direct spiritual experience without institutional mediation. These practices threatened the Church's role as the exclusive intermediary between God and humanity and suggested that individuals could achieve spiritual development through methods that bypassed ecclesiastical authority. The cultural evidence was equally troubling.
Templars had adopted Islamic architectural styles, artistic techniques, and even dietary customs that demonstrated identification with Islamic civilization rather than European Christendom. This cultural assimilation suggested loyalties that transcended religious boundaries and implied commitments that might conflict with Christian interests in future crises. The Vatican's response to these discoveries was complicated by the Templars' continued military effectiveness and their valuable contributions to Crusader defense capabilities. Despite their theological and cultural deviations, the Templars remained formidable warriors whose military expertise was crucial for maintaining Christian positions in the Holy Land. Immediate confrontation might eliminate valuable defensive capabilities while the Muslim threat remained active. The papal strategy that emerged from these considerations involved patient documentation of Templar deviations while preparing for eventual action when political circumstances would permit decisive intervention without compromising immediate Christian military interests. This approach required maintaining the appearance of continued papal support for the Templars while secretly building the case for their eventual suppression. The evidence-gathering process revealed the sophisticated nature of Templar operational security and the extent to which they had insulated their most sensitive activities from external observation. The order's hierarchical structure and oath-bound secrecy made it difficult for papal investigators to obtain definitive proof of the most serious allegations, while their wealth and influence enabled them to cultivate protective relationships with powerful secular authorities. By 1187, the Vatican had accumulated sufficient evidence to justify serious concerns about Templar orthodoxy and loyalty, but lacked the political opportunity to act decisively without risking immediate damage to Christian interests in the Holy Land. The coming crisis that would culminate in Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem would provide the test that would determine whether Templar accommodations with Islamic civilization represented pragmatic adaptation or fundamental betrayal of Christian principles.
You're in a hidden chamber beneath the Templar fortress at Croc des Chevaliers, 1188, where an extraordinary gathering is taking place that would be considered treason by both Christian and Muslim authorities. Around a circular table sit Knights Templar, Islamic scholars, Jewish rabbis, and Eastern Christian clerics, engaged in discussions that challenge the fundamental assumptions of medieval religious warfare. What you're witnessing is the emergence of a revolutionary vision, the possibility that the children of Abraham could find common ground that transcends the political and theological divisions that have defined their relationships for centuries. The conspiracy theories that emerged from the Templar secret relationship with Saladin weren't entirely unfounded. There was indeed conspiracy taking place, but its goals were far more ambitious and idealistic than simple military or commercial advantage. The hidden alliance had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval history, a systematic attempt to bridge the theological, cultural, and political divides that separated the three Abrahamic faiths. The theoretical foundation for this bridge-building project emerged from scholarly exchanges that had revealed remarkable similarities between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mystical traditions. Templar scholars working with Muslim and Jewish counterparts had discovered that all three faiths contained esoteric teachings about direct spiritual experience, divine unity, and the transcendence of sectarian boundaries that offered possibilities for theological reconciliation. These discoveries weren't merely academic curiosities, but practical foundations for political cooperation. If the three faiths shared common spiritual insights, if their mystical traditions pointed towards similar ultimate realities, and if their ethical teachings emphasized comparable values of justice, compassion, and service to God, then the religious warfare that had devastated the Holy Land might be based on misunderstandings rather than irreconcilable differences. The Templars' role in this interfaith project reflected their unique position as Western Christians who had gained intimate knowledge of Eastern religious traditions through their Palestinian experiences. Unlike European clergy, who knew Islam only through polemical literature, the Templars had worked with Muslim scholars, observed Islamic religious practices firsthand, and discovered that their Islamic counterparts were neither the demons nor the ignorant infidels that European propaganda portrayed. The practical implications of interfaith cooperation had already been demonstrated through the Templars' administrative success in governing religiously diverse territories. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations had learned to coexist peacefully under Templar authority, while commercial and cultural exchanges had created prosperity that benefited all participants. These local successes suggested that broader reconciliation might be possible if appropriate frameworks could be developed. The theological discussions that supported this interfaith project required extraordinary intellectual courage from all participants. Christian scholars had to acknowledge that Islamic and Jewish traditions contained valid insights into divine truth, while Muslim participants had to accept that Christianity offered legitimate approaches to spiritual development. Jewish scholars, who had experienced persecution from both Christian and Muslim authorities, had to overcome centuries of defensive isolation to engage in collaborative theological exploration. The breakthrough came through focus on shared scriptural foundations rather than doctrinal differences. All three traditions recognized Abraham as a foundational figure, accepted the Hebrew prophets as divinely inspired, and acknowledged Jerusalem as a sacred center. These common elements provided sufficient theological basis for cooperation without requiring any tradition to abandon its distinctive beliefs or practices. The political vision that emerged from these theological foundations was revolutionary for its time. Rather than viewing the Holy Land as territory that must be controlled exclusively by one religious community, the participants envisioned a confederation where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish authorities would exercise jurisdiction over their respective populations while cooperating on matters of common concern. This confederate model would allow each religious community to maintain its distinctive identity and institutions while participating in broader governance structures that promoted stability, prosperity, and justice for all inhabitants. Religious pilgrimage would be protected and facilitated for all three faiths, while commercial and cultural exchanges would be encouraged rather than restricted by religious boundaries. The military implications of this interfaith alliance were equally significant. Rather than maintaining separate armies that competed for resources and territory, the Confederation would establish joint defense forces capable of protecting the region against external threats while maintaining internal security. These combined military units would operate under unified command structures that transcended religious divisions. The economic benefits of religious cooperation had already been demonstrated through Templar commercial innovations, but the Interfaith Project envisioned much broader integration. Standardized commercial law would protect merchants and traders regardless of their religious affiliation, while joint infrastructure projects would improve transportation, communication, and agricultural productivity throughout the region.
The cultural dimensions of the Interfaith Project reflected recognition that religious diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Educational institutions would be established where scholars from all three traditions could collaborate on advancing human knowledge, while artistic and architectural projects would combine different cultural traditions to create hybrid forms that expressed shared values. The most radical aspect of this interfaith vision involved religious practice itself. While maintaining their distinctive institutions and beliefs, the three communities would create opportunities for spiritual dialogue and shared contemplative practices that emphasized common mystical insights. These interfaith spiritual exercises wouldn't require doctrinal compromise, but would demonstrate the underlying unity that transcended surface differences. The practical implementation of this vision faced enormous obstacles from extremist factions within all three religious communities. Christian zealots viewed any accommodation with non-Christians as betrayal of fundamental principles, while Muslim militants demanded complete Islamic control over territories that had been conquered in the name of jihad. Jewish communities traumatized by centuries of persecution, were suspicious of any arrangement that might leave them vulnerable to renewed oppression. The secrecy that had protected the initial Templar-Saladin negotiations became even more crucial as the interfaith project expanded to include additional participants. Discovery of these comprehensive discussions would have triggered violent reactions from religious authorities who depended on sectarian conflict to maintain their own power and influence. The participants understood that their vision represented a fundamental challenge to the entire medieval system of religious authority. If the three Abrahamic faiths could find common ground and cooperate successfully, it would undermine the exclusive claims to truth that justified ecclesiastical hierarchy and religious warfare. Such a demonstration of interfaith cooperation would eliminate the external threats that forced religious communities to accept authoritarian leadership. The historical timing of this interfaith project was both advantageous and problematic. The exhaustion caused by decades of religious warfare had created conditions where alternative approaches might gain acceptance, while the practical successes of Templar governance demonstrated that religious cooperation could produce beneficial results. However, the same conditions that made cooperation attractive also made it threatening to established authorities who benefited from continued conflict. The external pressures that had originally motivated Templar-Saladin cooperation were intensifying rather than diminishing. The approaching Third Crusade would bring new European armies determined to reclaim Jerusalem through military conquest, while internal political developments in both Christian and Muslim territories were strengthening extremist factions opposed to any accommodation with religious enemies. The conspiracy theories that surrounded the Templars were accurate in recognizing that something unprecedented was taking place, but they underestimated the scope and significance of what was actually being attempted. The hidden alliance with Saladin had grown into a comprehensive project for religious reconciliation that could have transformed the entire course of human civilization if it had succeeded.
You stand at the crossroads of revelation, where 8 centuries of buried secrets converge into a truth so profound that it challenges everything you thought you knew about religious warfare, medieval politics, and the possibility of human reconciliation across seemingly irreconcilable differences. The question that has haunted this investigation, whether the Knights Templar truly forged a secret alliance with Saladin, has an answer that is both simpler and more complex than anyone could have imagined. The evidence accumulated throughout this investigation points to an inescapable conclusion. The Templars and Saladin did indeed reach a secret understanding that transcended the religious warfare of their time. But this alliance was not the simple political accommodation that conspiracy theories have imagined. It was something far more ambitious and dangerous, an attempt to fundamentally restructure medieval civilization along lines that emphasized cooperation over conflict, shared humanity over sectarian identity, and practical wisdom over ideological purity. The historical record, when examined through the lens of this secret alliance, reveals patterns that conventional Crusades historiography has never adequately explained. The unusual moderation that characterized Templar-Saladin military encounters, the remarkable prosperity of territories under Templar administration, the sophisticated cultural exchanges that flourished in regions where the two forces cooperated, and the eventual persecution of both organizations by their supposed allies all make sense when understood as consequences of a comprehensive accommodation that threatened established power structures. The alliance began as a practical response to shared challenges that neither organization could address through conventional means alone. The Templars needed stability to protect their commercial interests and territorial holdings, while Saladin required breathing space to consolidate control over fractious Muslim territories while preparing for larger strategic challenges. Both organizations recognized that continued warfare served neither side's real interests, and that cooperation could achieve objectives that conflict never could. The transformation of this practical accommodation into a visionary project for interfaith reconciliation reflected the intellectual sophistication and spiritual depth of leaders who had transcended the limited perspectives of their contemporaries. The Templars' exposure to Islamic civilization had revealed possibilities for Christian-Muslim cooperation that European isolation had made inconceivable, while Saladin's appreciation for European learning and administrative techniques had demonstrated the benefits of cultural synthesis. The theological foundations of their alliance were more solid than either organization's critics understood. All three Abrahamic faiths shared sufficient common ground to support political cooperation without requiring doctrinal compromise. The mystical traditions within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism pointed toward spiritual realities that transcended sectarian boundaries, while the ethical teachings of all three religions emphasized justice, compassion, and service to divine purposes that could unite rather than divide their adherents. The practical successes achieved through this interfaith cooperation demonstrated that religious diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Territories governed according to Confederate principles prospered economically, developed culturally, and maintained stability that purely sectarian approaches couldn't match. Educational institutions that brought together scholars from different traditions advanced human knowledge more effectively than isolated religious academies. Commercial networks that operated across religious boundaries generated wealth that benefited all participants. The ultimate failure of this alliance resulted not from its internal contradictions, but from external pressures applied by authorities who correctly recognized that successful interfaith cooperation threatened their own power and legitimacy. The Vatican's persecution of the Templars and the political pressures that eventually destroyed Saladin's successors both reflected systematic efforts to eliminate alternatives to religious warfare that made ecclesiastical and political authority seem unnecessary. The historical implications of this secret alliance extend far beyond medieval studies to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of religious conflict and the possibilities for human reconciliation. If the most powerful Christian military order and the greatest Muslim leader of their time could find common ground, it suggests that religious warfare may be more a product of political manipulation than theological necessity.
The destruction of this alliance and the suppression of evidence about its existence created historical narratives that emphasized inevitable conflict between different civilizations while obscuring successful examples of interfaith cooperation. The standard accounts of the Crusades as purely sectarian warfare serve the interests of those who benefit from religious division while concealing possibilities for accommodation that could address contemporary conflicts. The modern implications of this historical revelation are particularly relevant given current tensions between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities worldwide. The medieval precedent of successful Templar-Saladin cooperation demonstrates that even the most entrenched religious conflicts may have solutions that transcend conventional approaches based on competitive advantage and zero-sum thinking. The theological lessons of this alliance remain applicable to contemporary interfaith relations. The discovery that Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mystical traditions point toward compatible spiritual insights suggests that religious diversity may reflect different approaches to common divine realities rather than fundamentally contradictory revelations. This perspective could provide foundations for cooperation that don't require any tradition to abandon its distinctive beliefs or practices. The political model developed through Templar-Saladin cooperation offers frameworks for addressing contemporary conflicts in regions where different religious communities compete for control. Confederate arrangements that allow each group to maintain its identity while participating in broader governance structures could provide alternatives to both assimilation and partition that have proven inadequate for resolving entrenched disputes. However, the ultimate failure of the medieval alliance also provides warnings about the challenges facing contemporary reconciliation efforts.
The forces that destroyed Templar-Saladin cooperation, extremist factions within each religious community, political authorities who benefit from continued conflict, and external powers who manipulate religious divisions for strategic advantage, remain active in modern contexts and pose similar threats to current peace initiatives. The question facing modern humanity is whether we have evolved sufficient wisdom and courage to succeed where the medieval alliance failed. Contemporary global communication, international legal frameworks, and educational institutions provide tools for building understanding that weren't available in the medieval period. But the same fundamental challenge remains: overcoming narrow sectarian identities to embrace shared humanity while maintaining distinctive cultural and religious traditions. The secret of the Templars and Saladin wasn't just that they made peace with each other. It was that they discovered possibilities for human cooperation that transcended the limitations of their time. Their hidden alliance represented humanity's first systematic attempt to move beyond religious warfare toward a civilization based on mutual respect, shared learning, and collaborative problem-solving. The evidence for this alliance has been hidden for 8 centuries, buried in archives, disguised in diplomatic language, and obscured by historical narratives that serve the interests of those who benefit from religious conflict. But the truth has survived in fragments sufficient to reconstruct the extraordinary story of what might have been, and what still might be, if humanity chooses wisdom over warfare. The final question isn't whether the Templars and Saladin forged a secret alliance. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is whether their vision of interfaith cooperation represents a practical possibility for contemporary civilization, or a utopian dream that ignores the realities of human nature and political power. Perhaps the answer lies not in historical analysis, but in contemporary choice. The Templars and Saladin proved that even the most entrenched religious conflicts can be transcended through vision, courage, and commitment to shared human values. Whether their example inspires modern emulation or remains a historical curiosity depends on decisions being made today by people who face challenges remarkably similar to those that confronted these medieval pioneers of interfaith cooperation. The truth that history hides may be ready for revelation, but only if humanity is prepared to embrace possibilities that our ancestors glimpsed but couldn't fully realize. The secret alliance of the Knights Templars and Saladin offers both inspiration and warning for those who would attempt to build bridges across the divisions that continue to separate human communities in our own troubled time.